Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Presuppositionalism podcast. I'm joined by Andrew Stratelites, and we will be joined a little bit later by Logos to discuss the Euthyphro. This is the first installment of a series which we will hopefully have where we discuss all of the Platonic dialogues and just sort of give our reflections on them and then see how they're relevant to today and to broader philosophical questions. So Andrew, why don't we start with you?
Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Andrew Stratelites, and we're going over the Euthyphro Dilemma and Dialogue, which is one of the more famous Platonic dialogues. Plato's dialogues are very deep and layered pieces of literature that cover both like historical interactions of Socrates with others through sort of the perspective of Plato or people Plato heard, as well as teaching what Plato understood to be Socrates' philosophy through multiple layers. And so this is probably a historical context of Socrates actually discussing with Euthyphro the details of these charges that he brought against his father, but also touches on much deeper themes through that are touched on by the rest of Plato's thought, including things like realism, how can we know things, the relationship between concepts and actualities, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting, to sort of as a preface to all this, is when I went to college, my professor said that Plato was kind of like rock and roll, and Aristotle was like classical music. One of the things that's interesting about reading the Euthyphro Dilemma and the Euthyphro Dialogue, and by extension the rest of the Platonic corpus, is how modern it feels. Like it almost feels like something that you could see today. Just some guy on the street haranguing people, asking them, to question their most basic assumptions. If you read, say, the classical histories or the sort of like Xenophon or Herodotus or Thucydides, or maybe you read the poetic epics like the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. They all have this very serious, somber tone and grand epic feel, whereas the Euthyphro feels down to earth, mundane, fairly normal, just two guys having a talk in a courthouse, in a way that I think resonates a lot more with people today as just individuals, and even seems to have that feeling or sense of modern like we would have today. What are your thoughts on that, Andrew?
Yeah, I'd say that the Platonic dialogues have a lot of depth to them, and I think that part of it is the influence of them on the literary tradition in the West has in some sense formed our understanding of how dialogue and interactions work. So I think that might be why it feels so modern in some ways, is it's sort of the example of one of the ways that we record in literature the interactions between people. Yeah. Like if you look at like Japanese literature or other things, it tends to have a very different feel.
Yeah. Now, at the onset of the Euthyphro, Socrates is waiting his trial, which is covered in the Apology, and he claims that a man by the name of Miletus is the one levying the chief accusations against him, the accusations of impiety. And when he's waiting for his case, he meets Euthyphro also waiting for his case. And so he asks Euthyphro, "What are you doing here?" And he's like, "Well, I'm trying my father for murder." And he's like, "Well, really? Why?" And he's like, "Well, because it's impious to murder." And of course, he murdered a slave, according to Euthyphro. And Socrates is like, "Well, okay, but isn't that impious though to level charges against your father?" And he's like, "Well, no, we're appealing to a higher standard, the gods. The gods demand that we do this." And then Socrates is like, "Really? So, and what is piety?" And so as a backdrop to this too, he's also kind of rather snarkily saying, "Well, if you know so much, Euthyphro," because Euthyphro says that he can divine the will of the gods. He's like, "Well, if you're that smart, you could help me divine the will of the gods to refute the people charging me with impiety by telling them what piety truly is." And Euthyphro begins by saying, "Well, piety is what's loved by the gods," and Plato's like, "Well, that's interesting. What do you mean? Do you believe all the stories of the gods?" The stories basically being as transcribed by Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And as we'll get to if and when we get to the Republic, he throws some serious shade at Homer. He's not a fan of the poets. Specifically, he's not a fan of Homer. And so he opens up by saying, well, what happens when the gods disagree? Because if you believe the poets, then they're always at war with each other. They have passions. What is pleasing to one god might not be pleasing to another god. Which god is it? And Euthyphro's like, well, that all the gods. This is what all the gods believe. And he's like, well, okay. So first of all, Socrates is pointing out that there's a contradiction between the gods. Some gods are opposed to each other, so you might be pious to one god but not to another. So the other thing then is, if he says all the gods, what we then end up with is now Socrates is shifting the argument to, well, okay, now what then makes something good, right? Is it just the fact that all the gods love it, or do all the gods love it because it is good? So I think at this point we'll stop, and I'll let you sort of comment, Andrew, on your thoughts up to this point in the dialogue.
Yeah, so the classic meat in this is basically a refutation of a form of polytheism, right? If you have these multiple standards, you can't use one of these of like what Mars considers pious and put it against what Janus thinks is pious. Or I'm sorry, I'm probably mixing up Roman and Greek gods, but like you can't take one standard and use it to figure out which one is the right standard. And this implies that conceptually there must be a higher standard above these things, right? And if what is good is what's loved by the good, this sort of this problem falls away. Another sort of implicit thing, or at least in my reading, is Euthyphro seems to actually be possibly using a pretext to charge his father with murder, because as Socrates points out, you can pick any god and they would think that one thing was pious and another impious, and so he might be engaged in motivated reasoning to bring this against his father for some other reason, to get his inheritance early or what have you. And that I think is an interesting thing to keep in mind too. And Logos will chat about this more, but basically the issue is, in a context, you have to look at something sort of above the context to truly understand it until you get to the top of the pyramid, right? And that's sort of what he's showing, is that the gods aren't the top of the pyramid. There are multiple ones, so it can't be the pinnacle.
Yeah. Now, with the classic dilemma of the Euthyphro dilemma, part of the problem is, as it's been sort of popularized today, it's often been used, I think, inappropriately in the sort of theist atheist debates that have been going on over the last, say, 20 years, because ultimately a lot of the force, I think, is lost if you have just one god, because now you have something that's consistent. You don't have to worry about, parts and passions or competing enterprises. So, and that's not really the point, because the whole point is what Socrates is saying is, well, look, if there are all these different gods and all these different gods don't get along, then they themselves cannot be the basis of morality, which again is an objection that no one would raise to a monotheistic deity, because, he's identical to himself. There's no competing influences within him. So that's a problem. But once you have this dilemma of, is it loved because it's lovable, right? Or is it loved because the gods love it? If you say that it's love because the gods love it. Then somebody might say, well, wasn't that just capricious? Because right, in classical philosophy and ethics, for something to be loved, there has to be something lovable about it, right? Now, we're going to have ourselves with Aristotle, but Aristotle describes, things as being lovable because there's something about them that is to be desired. But if that thing about them which is to be desired is independent of the one desiring it, well, then it's this thing outside of the one desiring it. So, can the one who has that desire for that thing be the source of the valuation of ethics? And then the other one is, it could just sound capricious. It's like, well, we just say so. It's like a fiat or a diktat. But why would that be the case? I mean, why would one think that that's the case? I don't think you necessarily would. What we also see as it goes on, there's a little funny wordplay about Daedalus, the father of Icarus, and the great engineer. That they're moving each other around by their arguments, like Daedalus moves people around with his pulleys and levers, kind of like the proto Archimedes, if you will. And then they move to the next level of, well, once they go around that circle for a little bit with the Daedalus joke, then they say, well, Euthyphro says, what is good is, what is good for the thing, right? So Socrates says, well, let's start over again because we seem to have gotten stuck. Why don't we define piety some other way? And Euthyphro's like, well, it's doing what is good for something. And he's like, and Socrates like, oh, okay, so like, if you breed cattle, then a good herdsman would look out for the well-being of the cattle, or a good captain would look out for the good needs of his crew, or a good physician would look out for the needs. And he's like, exactly. And then he's like, but what do the gods need from us? What, we can't give them anything they don't already have. They might give us stuff that we want, and in that case they're good to us, but what can we give them that they want? Because they don't need anything. According to the poets, the gods are immortal beings. They don't need anything from us. And of course, if you say that we're like herdsmen or pilots or doctors to the gods, it sounds laughable. So Euthyphro kind of just walks into this one. And this is one of the things that I've noticed about a lot of the dialogues, because of course Plato writes these for a purpose. Sometimes they feel a bit forced. Like, on the one hand, I have had enough real life experience with people in discussions that they sometimes do walk into stuff just like Euthyphro did. So it can happen, but I just feel like it happens all the time and very conveniently. So maybe it's Plato sort of like steering it a little bit. But by the same token, though, I have had enough experience debating people that I have seen that as well. So maybe Athens at that stage in history was just prone for people falling into that trap. And as they sort of do this, basically Euthyphro's like, well, we give the gods honors, and they don't really need them, but that's what they get from us. And then it comes full circle back to, well, but why do they want honors? Well, it's because they love them, right? So then the gods, it's good because the gods love it. And then at that point, Euthyphro's kind of like, well, I got to go. Can't really solve this. I've got a court case to go to. And that sort of closes out the Euthyphro dialogue. So Andrew, any thoughts on that so far?
Yeah, I guess the key thing that seems to be danced around with this, right, is that the way out of this is some sort of like realism, right? That honor or lovableness or things are not just relational or properties of like these deities, but something grander and bigger that both the lovable thing and the lover participate in, right? And that seems like Socrates does a very good job of like drawing all the negative space around that without saying it explicitly in this dialogue. And he even touches on it, like, what is why do the gods love it, right? Or because the gods don't need anything, right? And that actually piece we can apply to God, that God doesn't need anything. And so in a very real sense, the love God has for us is ontologically different than the sort of love that we have for even nature or things that are good for us, and so on and so forth.
One thing that's sort of a underlying theme throughout all of this is a sort of like snide cynicism of Euthyphro, because Socrates is sort of like, you can almost just hear, see the sarcasm dripping as he's saying, oh, of course, Euthyphro, just tell me everything that you know so that I can, silly old me can learn what true piety is. Now this is interesting, right? Now Socrates is of course a very sarcastic character throughout much of the dialogues. But in this case, it's not clear if he knows Euthyphro in private life before. They seem to be at least familiar with each other. The question that I have is he does he have something against Euthyphro? Is he being sarcastic because he's something he has against him, or is it just his MO in general?
Yeah, and my little pet theory, right? I don't have anything but my intuition to do this. Is that I feel like Euthyphro probably is bringing charges against his father falsely or illegitimately, and that's part of the reason Socrates is letting him have it.
Exactly. And again, this is interesting, right? Because maybe this is important since this is leading up to the apology where he's tried for impiety to the gods by criticizing Euthyphro for his stance that you shouldn't take this action against your father. That is actually in line with the baseline Athenian morality of the day. They would have been horrified at this. So might it be the case that Plato is trying to exonerate Socrates by saying, "Hey, look, you want to see a real lout? Here's Euthyphro. He's taking his own dad to court. If you want to have a real impious person, that's the one."
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind too, right? Is um, in some sense, the charges brought against Socrates were correct in that he was claiming the old gods or old systems were false. But at the same time, it seems like Socrates was actually brought to that by his sense of piety to the good or to this higher standard that he sort of felt that the mythos of Athens was not fulfilling.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea of competing interests amongst the gods, which is an argument against polytheism. Uh, I think it's in his Metaphysics. Aristotle makes a similar claim that if there's order in the universe, and if there were no, uh, all the gods were, if either all the gods weren't on the same page, or there just wasn't one god, then why would we have any order at all? And looks like Logos just joined the stream. So welcome, Logos. We just sketched out basically the Euthyphro and talked about it a little bit, but I know you have a lot of stuff that you have to say.
Hey, how's it going? Sorry I was a little bit late. I had another engagement I had to take care of, but yeah. I mean, there is a lot to say. I mean, I don't think I could fit it all into an opening statement. I guess to start off by summarizing my view of the dialogue, it covers such a wide range of stuff depending on how liberal you read the text. I mean, I've seen everything in here from objective or subjective morality, conflicting model systems. Mill's argument from omnipotence is buried in the text somewhere, if I'm interpreting it correctly. I mean, I've seen just all sorts of craziness in here. It's a really good. It's one of my favorite Socratic dialogues, easily. So that's, I guess, all I have to open with for now.
No, that's great. I know. Prior to this, you mentioned how John Stuart Mill seems to have plagiarized Socrates here. Why don't we sort of explore that a little bit?
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't want to derail the topic that you and Andrew were already on, but yeah. So here's one part of the dialogue that really stood out to me. I don't know if Mill plagiarized it. That was just me poking a little fun, but it does bear a very, very uncanny resemblance to the gist of what Mill was getting at when he was looking at the problem of God's omnipotence. So the section of the dialogue I highlighted goes like this. So Socrates asks, Good, but I still must ask, what is this attention to the gods which is called piety? Euthyphro says, it is such, Socrates, as servants show to their masters. Socrates says, I understand, a sort of ministration to the gods. Euthyphro says, exactly. Socrates says, well, medicine is also a sort of ministration or service, having in view the attainment of some object, would you not say, of health? Euthyphro says, I should. Socrates says, there is an art which ministers to the shipbuilder with the view to the attainment of some result. Yes, Socrates. And there's an art which ministers to the house builder with a view to building a house. And now tell me, my good friend, about the art which ministers to the gods. What work does that help to accomplish? For you must surely know is, if as you say, you are of all men living, the one who is best instructed in religion. Um, and it goes a little bit further, but the basic gist of this questioning that stood out to me is what Socrates is getting at here is the gods are kind of perfect manifestations, whether you take a monotheistic view or an elemental view that the Greeks did, where you have the god of the sea, of wine, of the harvest, and so on. The gods are basically the perfect and ultimate powerful manifestation of whatever it is that they do. And so Socrates is saying, like, well, I mean, if piety is ministration, is providing some service to the gods, what service could this omnipotent, at least conditionally omnipotent being need from us? What does Ares need from us to make him good at war? What does Aphrodite need from us to make her the goddess of love? Like, what do the gods get out of our doing what we do for them? And how that kind of relates to Mill's omnipotence argument is Mill made the interesting observation that um, if God has a will of some kind, then well, this is where people may disagree with Mill. It gets more complicated, but the gist of it is God applies some means to an end, right? He uses something for some purpose, but God's omnipotent. So what exactly why would an omnipotent thing that could do anything any which way, as long as it's not a blatant contradiction, need to apply any particular means to a particular end? So Mill's question is a bit more general than Socrates, but Socrates is getting at the same thing here. Why would all powerful gods need us mere mortal ministers to provide to them anything which they couldn't lack, basically by definition? And that's the root of Socrates' confusion.
Yeah, Andrew, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we touched on this a little bit before, but from a Christian perspective, this is outlining very explicitly in sort of the negative space the difference between God's grace and the other types of love that we experience more consistently in life, right? The love that God has, or in whatever form, is a sort of agape or grace. Where it isn't due to any need on God's part, but is a free gift, which is different than sort of like the philia or the other types of love that we experience that are analogous to it. And that's exactly right, that it doesn't make sense for God or the gods if they have this sort of relationship of omnipotence or perfection, to be in the same sort of like ontological category or the same regime of action, that they're not in the same stadium playing the same game we are, so to speak.
Yeah. Now, this is something that, again, Logos, you and Andrew and I were talking about earlier, but the idea that the core issue with the Euthyphro dilemma is that of a model comparison. So maybe you go into that a little bit.
Yeah. So the very first section that struck out to me as I was reading the Euthyphro Dilemma goes something like this. Socrates says, remember that I did not ask you to give me 2 or 3 examples of piety, but to explain the general idea which makes all pious things to be pious. Do you not recollect that there was one idea which made the impious impious and the pious pious? Euthyphro says, yeah, I remember. Socrates says, tell me what is the nature of this idea, and then I shall have a standard to which I may look, and by which I may measure actions, whether yours or those of anyone else. And then I shall be able to say that such and such is an action is pious, and such another is impious. And really you could apply this problem to all sorts of things, not just piety and very abstract religious stuff. I was in an argument with people on my Discord server the other day about how this relates to science. So, for example, there are certain types of hypotheses that some of the sciencey people on my server would not count as a scientific hypothesis. And my immediate question is, well, why? Science has to be gatekeepy such that there are certain hypotheses or propositions or ways of describing the world that are sciency, and there are ones that aren't. So you have to have a really good way of describing science such that we know what the sciency ones are, and we don't know we know what the sciency ones aren't. In the same way as we want to know what pious things are and pious things aren't. And basically, after going around for a bit, I gave them kind of a Euthyphro dilemma with regard to science, that's very similar to the one that Socrates asked of gods. He asked, what does he say? Are things pious because they are loved by the gods, or are they loved by the gods because they're pious? And so my kind of version of that, I'm still kicking it around, trying to smooth it out a little bit, but it's something like, um, uh, are the things that scientists do science, or is science what the scientists do? Something to that effect. Um, because the problem is fundamentally the same. I want to know from an a priori, non ad hoc perspective what kinds of things and propositions you expect or I expect to be the sciencey ones and the ones that don't. And if I can't, we get in this vicious circularity where science is what the scientists do. Well, what is it the scientists do? What they do, science and sciencey stuff, and round and round it goes, which is the exact same thing which Socrates kind of gets at later on when he says, uh, and a thing is not seen because it is not visible, but conversely, visible because it is seen. Nor is a thing led because it is in the state of being led, or carried because it's in the state of being carried, but the converse of this. And so on. There's two kind of conjoined blocks of text where he's kind of getting at this issue where you don't you don't just define carried things as in the state of being carried. You get some circularity there and so on. You have to have some ways of kind of like splitting it. And um so much is made of the Euthyphro dilemma relative to like objective morality and the moral argument for God and so on, but I don't think enough people focus on where the horns of the dilemma come from. The horns of the dilemma come from trying to avoid the circularity. So we avoid saying stuff like, holy stuff is what God likes. Well, how do I know what God likes? Well, he's going to like the holy stuff. Well, okay, what's going to be the holy stuff? It's going to be the stuff that God likes. So you split it into horns and hope that each horn gives you some information. That way I know, instead of going around in a circle, I know there's like two distinct branches. I can figure out, what's the stuff God likes that's holy, and vice versa. So that's kind of the model selection problem that applies to almost everything, but this dialogue sets it up very beautifully.
So, one of my favorite definitions of physics is the study of things for which the tools of physicists are effective at studying. And that sounds like it's hitting that circularity, right?
Exactly. Yes. I thought of our conversation on that as well.
Yeah, the other thing is the real absolute importance of this in finding out what model you're using. Now, this is something that Logos, you and I talked about privately when we were investigating what exactly is argumentation ethics. But it's not argumentation ethics. I always get it confused with presuppositionalism, rather. Presuppositionalism in apologetics. And one of the things that if you read Van Til, what he's trying to do is he's trying to say, well, we don't want to do classical apologetics. We just want to use this. But what is actually, presuppositionalism, as near as I can tell, is actually more of a methodology rather than an argument. And it's the idea that you use language analogically by jumping inside someone's worldview and then pointing out to them that what they want to support with their worldview is not consonant with other things they believe. Which is interesting, is it's essentially the Socratic method, which is kind of odd for him to say, well, I don't want this, classical apologetics, when he's literally using the Socratic method. But so many people smuggle in a assumption about what counts as evidence, what doesn't count as evidence, what counts as a valid way, a valid inquiry of knowledge, and what doesn't, and they don't ever tell you that. And it creates this dishonesty, because in logic and debate, one of the things you have to do is you have to avoid the fallacy of the implied premise. You have to have all your premises on the table. You can't have an implied premise, because that muddies the waters. And in a debate, if you can point out there's an implied premise that's not being stated, then the person who points that out gains the upper hand. And what we see here is that Socrates, or Plato through Socrates, is showing us that we have to go all the way to the top in this. Is there any more on this you want to say, Logos?
Sorry, I had to find my cursor to unmute myself. Yeah, and you're right about the presuppositions, evidence, and things like that. It drives me very, very nuts when I hear, even as a non-believer in the Christian sense, hearing things like, there's no evidence for God and things like this. On the one hand, I kind of get a sense of what they mean, but on the other hand, the people asking the question just really hide behind a lot of vagaries. And what you were really talking about as far as like presuppositions and stuff, the first thing that popped into my head, so I had to look it up, is Hempel's dilemma relative to the philosophy of mind. And the basic gist of it goes like this, right? If you want to say that the mind is reducible to physical phenomena, we have a problem. So what do you mean by that? Because if you mean that the mind is explained by our current theories of physics, and that's what you mean by physical phenomena, well, there's a whole bunch that's not explained currently, which neuroscientists will tell you by even our best physical theories. But if on the other hand, what you mean is the mind will be explained by our best physical theories in some kind of future case, we have another problem yet still, because now we have to ask if we are ad hocly leading the science, right? Are we saying that we think that science in a vacuum will kind of help us out and explain this? Or as Hempel was afraid, are we saying something like we will exclude all the physical theories a priori, which don't help us fully explain the mind? Because if that's what we really mean by it, then saying the mind's reducible to physical facts just means we're just going to throw all physical theories out until we kind of like have the needle in a haystack we're looking for that makes us work. And that's basically getting at the heart of what you're getting at in the evidence thing. Because if you define evidence very, very narrowly, such that it excludes certain arguments for God or certain like religious experiences or something like that, like a priori, then it's kind of like a fool's errand to ask somebody for evidence. It's like, hey, give me evidence for X, but I'm going to define evidence in such a way that would just exclude categorically anything you could provide me in the affirmative for the topic. And this is actually something that Bonson pointed out to his debate partner when me and you were looking at the precept debate. And I thought that was one of the more cogent points that Bonson made, and something that me and you talk about all the time. And it's something that this dialogue basically points out. I want to know, like, in the same way that Socrates wants to know if he's pious or impious, so he's going to be like punished for impiety to some god. I'm sure a religious person, when asked by a non-believer, would like to know, like, what kind of thing would count as the evidence you're looking for? How do I know if I'm wasting your time and not providing evidence, or wasting your time and not, like, what's the criteria? It's the same problem.
Yeah, and go ahead, Todd. You first.
No, I was just going to say, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and this, oh gosh, there's a great book on general systems theory that I have to get to, Logos and Todd. But basically, this problem happens because of underdeterminism of this level of modeling. And the only way out of it is you basically have to pop up or down. I think the right way to put it is you have to pop up a layer in your ontology and level of analysis to actually get it. And then at that point, what ends up happening is you end up basically having constellations of potential models, which, depending on the axioms that you hold, you either accept or reject. The classic sort of example is actually like realism versus like this sort of Nietzschean there are no facts, just interpretations, right? You either have to sort of accept that like things are real, or at least some things are real, or you reject it all. And depending on what you make on that one axiom, you end up having a constellation of possible solutions, right? On sort of the Nietzschean side, you can have straight Nietzsche, or you can have all sorts of different will to power things. And on the realist side, you can have Plato or Aristotle, or some forms of scientific realism, and so on and so forth. But you end up having to pop up the stack to sort of these more fundamental ways of modeling things, often including like epistemological things, like can you actually know true things, or are the things in your mind just like arbitrary?
One important thing too is how the Euthyphro ends. It ends at an impasse in the Greek aporia, where really what the dialogue really ends up doing is, instead of actually giving you an answer, it gets you to start thinking about a problem in a different way, and that does seem to be a general trend in Socratic dialogues, that there is this impasse that arises. But what Socrates has done, or rather Plato has done through Socrates, has sort of shifted the conversation to ask new questions and think about it in a new way. To maybe use a woo-woo terminology, it raised the consciousness of the interlocutors such that they're thinking about the same thing in a different, more sophisticated way. Is there anything you want to add to that, Logos?
No, I think that's exactly right.
Now, Andrew, one thing, given that we have this definitional problem, would you agree that the idea of the unity of the forms is in some sense Socrates' Plato's attempt to solve this definition dilemma?
Yeah, I would say so. A plausible thing that happened is Socrates himself taught something like this sort of negative space, right? Showing all the things that do not work. And then Plato articulated the unity of the forms as one solution to this. The Stoics have a slightly different metaphysics where like spirit is material, that also solves it, which is roughly Platonic. And Aristotle, of course, has his own take on it. And I think that's sort of a key thing to take away from the Platonic dialogues as well, is that the way Socrates, and I suspect this is actually Socrates' views and his procedure, is he carves things out through negative space rather than explicitly articulating things.
Yeah. What were some of the? I know you had, I think, 6 passages, Logos. Which ones haven't we covered yet?
Oh shoot, let me look. We've jumped around a little bit here. So we got that one. Oh yes. Okay. So another interesting one that popped out to me is how far ahead of his time Plato was through Socrates' character when talking about objective and subjective morality, and basically preempting the concept of irreconcilable differences in moral debate. So this is a really good passage that I just love. So Socrates says, "And further, Euthyphro, the gods were admitted to have enmities and hatreds and differences." Euthyphro says, "Yes, that was also said." Socrates says, "And what sort of difference creates enmity and anger? Suppose, for example, that you and I, my good friend, differ about a number. Do differences of this sort make us enemies and set us at variance with one another? Do we not go at once to arithmetic and put an end to them by a sum?" Euthyphro says, "True." Socrates says, "Or suppose we differ about magnitudes. Do we not quickly end the differences by measuring?" Euthyphro says, "Very true." Socrates says, "And we end a controversy about heavy and light by resorting to a weighing machine." And Euthyphro says, "To be sure." Socrates says, "But what differences are there which cannot be thus decided, and which therefore make us angry and set us at enmity with one another? I dare say the answer does not occur to you at the moment, and therefore I will suggest that these enmities arise when the matters of difference are just and unjust, good and evil, honorable and dishonorable. Are not these the points about which men differ? and about which, when we are unable satisfactorily to decide our differences, you and I and all of us quarrel, and when we do quarrel. So that basically gets to the heart of, I would say, the moral anti-realist or even subjectivist thrust. The idea that there are certain kinds of statements which we can easily take to be objective, truths of arithmetic, weight, geometry, facts, things that I call as a pragmatist facts. We take out a rule, we measure something and go, yeah, we see what that means. Versus truths. And a good way to distinguish between facts and truths, because people use them interchangeably, are go like this. Facts are the exhibits permitted in evidence at a trial, where everybody can look at them and go, okay, that's the exhibit. I see what that looks like. Truths are the conclusions juries come to after deliberating on the facts, right? They try to find out the truth about who murdered who. Did this person kill in self-defense? Was, what they did justified? Those are the higher level truths which people get by kind of like absorbing and talking about and discussing the facts. And this distinction forms the basis for like all the meaty moral disagreement, where what ethicists, especially like meta ethicists in philosophy, have been discovering is there's so many different topics where you can present people with like all the exhaustive list of physical facts and like first order like is statements about what's being said, and the two parties will just vehemently disagree. Like they can't point to any like fact of the matter where they like differ about a measure, a magnitude, or something like that. And they'll still disagree for other reasons, which tells moral theorists that the disagreements aren't reducible to like is objective, like fact-based propositions, but there must be something more and really interesting going on under the hood. And I just think that, Plato was ahead of his time and really like coming at this question.
Yeah, well, I mean, Andrew, it's morality is obviously just a math equation. Sam Harris said so, right?
Yes, it's a math equation where you start with like moral axioms, and then it's just utilitarianism, right? And that and the entire reason I think that people run into these issues is that the tools of like logic and measurement and these types of things are not applicable to questions of like honor, evil, and virtue. And you actually need to use human judgment to do it, which is contentious, right? Because human judgment is two things. It's imperfect, and it can be controlled by the will.
Yes. Logos.
Sure. So I suppose the next section that this dovetails into nicely is I call this the murder is a moral fallacy when talking about like ethics and objective morality and whatnot. People are like, oh, they're obvious, objective moral facts, and I'm like, okay, so what's a good example? They're like, well, murder is wrong, and I'm just like, yes, but murder is defined as illegal, immoral, wrongful killing, and so it's a tautology in the sense that wrongful killing is wrong. And to this day, in current year, to be all Justin Trudeau about it, you have to make this correction to people over and over and over again. When Socrates himself did it, well, Plato through Socrates, his character did it, however long ago this was written, 5th century BC or some crazy stuff. I'm not the historian. Anyway, so here's like the perfect section, like summarizes this. Socrates says, well, but speaking of men, Euthyphro, did you ever hear anyone arguing that a murderer or any sort of evildoer ought to be let off? Euthyphro says, I should rather say that these are questions which they are always arguing, especially in courts of law. They commit all sorts of crimes, and there's nothing which they will not do or say in their own defense. So Socrates says, but do they admit their guilt, Euthyphro, and yet say they ought not be punished? Euthyphro says, no, they do not. Socrates says, then there are some things which they do not venture to say and do, for they do not venture to argue that the guilty are to be unpunished, but they deny their guilt, do they not? Euthyphro says, yes. Socrates says, then they do not argue that the evildoer should not be punished, but they argue about the fact of who the evildoer is and what he did and when. Euthyphro says true. Right. So the fundamental moral question, as far as ethics are concerned, is it, given that we have some conception of wrongful killing, we call murder, the real meat on this thing is something like this. Is there an objective moral fact or definition by which an act or a circumstance or like something like objectively is or is not murder? So murder's wrong isn't the objective moral fact. That's kind of like an analytic tautology, like Bachelor's an Unmarried Man. Uh, the question really, just like piety, what's pious and impious? What is and isn't murder? And this is like really, really relevant given the Kyle Rittenhouse trial going on right now. That's 100K people watching Rakita's Law thing, like glued on this very question. If this were so cut and dry, that would make things a lot easier. And so Socrates getting at the heart of this, it's not that people on trial for murder say, well, morality is whatever, so murderers can go free. Usually they have the sense to say, hold on, here's the facts about what happened, but I didn't actually murder anybody. It's not true that I'm a murderer. And that's where all the stuff is. And so I just thought that was just really cool to also put in the dialogue.
Yeah, what this sort of reminds me of is it's very difficult, if not impossible, to have law with everybody having different fundamental assumptions about right and wrong, because normally law is determining that a thing was done. We all agree that that thing was wrong, but the contention is in the court, can you prove that that thing that was wrong was done? Now, we can't agree on what is wrong, and even if we can agree on what is wrong, it's so contextualized. You could have let's look at a landlord, charging rents. Everybody can see the same thing. A libertarian would say that that's a mutually beneficial ex ante contractual relationship, nothing to see here. And the far left would see it as an exploitative, oppressive system. They're saying the same thing, but they can't even agree on what that thing is. And in many ways, modern day America has the same sort of division that existed amongst the Olympian gods that Socrates is leveraging against Euthyphro. What are some of your thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of nuance to this, but fundamentally it comes down to whether as a society we're able to make consistent judgments about justification, right? Because that's fundamentally the difference between murder and lawful killing, is whether there is sufficient justification for the killing to occur. And some of the things that you see with the Kyle Rittenhouse trial is people seem to think that since he codes as an enemy, a political enemy, then there is no justification for him killing in self-defense. And that seems to be one of the key threads. The other thing, which is in some sense just as dangerous, is the people that code that since the people he shot were criminals, he needs no further justification as well. Which seems somewhat rare, but I have seen that too, and that comes down to not only shared axioms, but like shared phronosis of how have we trained our wisdom to work, right? If we were selected to be on a jury, would we all kind of do it in the same way, or is it radically different?
Yeah. Logos, do we have any more points to cover?
On that topic, yeah, there's one interesting follow-up. So the obvious interpretation of the Euthyphro Dilemma is, polytheistic. Trying to make one set of laws run a polytheistic society is good luck. And this, I think, is actually what you and Andrew were talking about right as I popped in. Is how disorganized would be if everything was organized by these disparate gods. But let's abstract it a little bit. We have the benefit of modern hindsight. We can look at these problems in consider a cosmopolitan society where you have a whole bunch of religious demographics in the society. We could say like Islam and Christianity, for an example. You can think of a possible world with others. Now each of these sects within the society are all monotheistic religions, but the fact that each subculture is worshiping one god instead of being polytheistic doesn't help society itself from succumbing to a sort of polytheism. And a good way you can see this is in the UK, where maybe not in the UK, there are some European countries, I think UK is one of them, where things are so off in certain parts of those countries where like there are like Muslim only areas and they have like de facto Sharia courts, which basically become the de facto law of the land. And so there's like an open question, like if something happens, am I prosecuted under state law or my local Sharia court? And they could very much come at odds. Um, and this could happen very easily. So it's not just polytheism that this this discussion takes dialogue. That's what I'm looking for. Sorry, I'm tired. Takes aim at. But a plurality of monotheistic ones. But also, as you and Andrew are getting at, you can abstract this even further. So it's very easy to think about these things as grounded in like a god, because it kind of puts this really abstract idea of like a moral system, like in a container we can talk about really easily. But the problem persists even if you remove gods from the equation. That the running joke is progressivism is a religion or something like that, but it's got the same problems ultimately, because if people share fundamentally different moral axioms, as you and Andrew said, you could take all those different moral axioms, put them all together in like some kind of a container, and if you're not going to call it a god, you could call it something like I don't know, a commandments list or
A system.
credo, a system. Yeah, I was looking for something more religious, maybe like a credo or something like that. And if people can just like make up their own credos and kind of do what they want, well, then we run into the real question, right? Person A does something, and a bunch of people just have a bunch of boos and yays in response to what person A did. And the Euthyphro dilemma starts all over again. Was person A pious or impious relative to these people's credos? And it runs without monotheism, polytheism. The whole problem runs all over again, just if you have like these moral containers in people's heads, which is why you have so many people seeing the same facts of a case and coming to just radically different conclusions.
Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah, and part of this, and I think that like Islam versus Christianity is especially an interesting case, because in some ways Islam is a holy law system and Christianity is a holy meta law system. In that Christianity doesn't actually articulate a specific law system that is necessary to be a Christian, but Islam does. And this is one of the contentions, right? And I'm not sure if it would happen if both were meta law systems, right? Like if you look at Mormonism and like mainline Protestantism, well, they might be too related, so they don't come into conflict. But that's sort of another interesting question: is if the systems or the credos are at different levels of analysis, what happens then, right? Or another example would be like Christianity versus like libertarianism, right? Both of those probably are meta law systems, but they can definitely come into tension and contention, and there's not a clear way to figure out which one is right unless you've made like a faith commitment.
Right. Well, we're nearing the end of the hour, so I'll move into the final statement. So we'll give you the first one, Logos.
Yeah, nothing new really to add. I think we've covered so much stuff. It's hard to summarize, to articulate the wide variety of different stuff we've talked about. So I guess I'll just close by saying, hopefully, in some of the sections I've read, my reasoning, I've impressed upon the audience just the diversity, the foresight, all the interesting topics that are in this dialogue. If you look, and how much this really preempted a lot of really important discussions we're still having. Hopefully, this dialogue is the first of many instances that'll demonstrate the often heard phrase, philosophy is a footnote to Plato.
All right, Andrew.
Yeah, I think this has been a great one to start with, because it sort of shows, just as Logo said, the depth that Socrates and Plato goes, but it also illustrates some of the nuances of like via negativa, the sort of interactions and underlying like historical things that might be true, like Euthyphro using it as a pretext, and yeah, just multiple layers.
All right. Thanks again, Logos, Andrew. Always a pleasure. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis to the Presuppositionalism podcast, signing off.